There is a quiet hunger beneath the surface of modern life. It is not the hunger for food or comfort, but the hunger for coherence. People today feel scattered, pulled in a dozen directions, as if their lives were made of separate rooms with no connecting hallway. In one chamber lies health, in another wealth, in another relationships, and in yet another spiritual longings that rarely see the light of day. Each room has its own demands, its own anxieties, its own vocabulary. And because they are separated, the person inhabiting them becomes divided as well. This fragmentation is not new. The human being has always lived at the crossroads of conflicting desires. But never before has the world offered so much stimulation and so little inner orientation. Never before have people been taught so many techniques for success, yet so few principles for meaning. Never before have we been so monitored, yet so misunderstood, especially by ourselves. The pursuit of health becomes a frantic attempt to control the body. The pursuit of wealth becomes a race without a finish line. The pursuit of harmony becomes a negotiation between external expectations and internal storms. People feel the pressure to optimize their diet, their finances, their habits, their thoughts, their productivity, their sleep cycle, their emotional resilience. Yet beneath the optimization lies a deeper question. What is the purpose of all this striving? What is the shape of a well-ordered life? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? Maimonides understood this ancient dilemma long before it became modern. He lived in a world that was itself divided, between philosophy and theology, between science and tradition, between rational inquiry and prophetic revelation, between the Jewish heritage he treasured and the intellectual currents of the Islamic Golden Age that transformed him. Yet he refused to fracture himself. Instead, he sought to weave a unified blueprint, a coherent architecture of human flourishing, where every part of life could be understood in its proper place, aligned with the ultimate truth. The modern crisis of fragmentation is, at its core, a crisis of vision. People know what they want in isolated categories. They want to be healthy. They want financial stability. They want relationships that bring peace instead of turmoil. They want to feel spiritually grounded. Yet they rarely possess an integrated understanding that shows how these pursuits relate to one another or how they emerge from the same root, the soul seeking order. Without such a blueprint, people experience life as a series of disconnected struggles. Health becomes a burden instead of a discipline. Wealth becomes a source of stress instead of generosity. Harmony becomes a fleeting moment rather than a cultivated state. The absence of a unifying principle leaves people vulnerable to extremes: indulgence disguised as pleasure, asceticism disguised as discipline, ambition disguised as meaning, and passivity disguised as peace. Maimonides taught that extremes are distortions, and that distortions lead the human being away from wisdom. A life without balance becomes a life without truth. The individual who pursues wealth without ethical grounding becomes enslaved to the very thing he seeks. The individual who pursues health without understanding the purpose of the body becomes obsessed with measurements and diets, forgetting the body is a vessel for the soul. And the individual who pursues spiritual elevation while ignoring the needs of the body and mind becomes detached from reality, drifting toward illusions. The fragmentation of modern existence creates a subtle form of exile. A person becomes exiled from his own nature, from his inner equilibrium, from his guiding purpose. Maimonides would call this exile a form of perplexity, the confusion that arises when one senses that there must be a higher order, yet cannot see it clearly. People feel the gap between what they are and what they could be, and they feel lost, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack integration. They have knowledge, but it is unorganized. They have desires, but they are unaligned. They have potential, but it is undirected. To understand the human dilemma, one must look honestly at the heart's unrest. It is not merely fatigue, nor dissatisfaction, nor ambition unmet. It is the tension of being a creature who is both physical and spiritual, temporal and eternal, rational and emotional, practical and contemplative. The human being stands at the intersection of worlds, always longing for unity, yet constantly experiencing division. The question that rises from this inner division is ancient. How does a person live well? Not merely how to survive or accumulate, but how to inhabit one's life with wisdom and harmony. How to navigate the world without becoming its prisoner. How to build a life that is expansive, purposeful, and internally ordered. How to move through the complexities of existence while remaining anchored to a deeper truth. Many people attempt to solve the dilemma outwardly. They change careers, diets, habits, environments. They search for routines that promise focus, gurus that promise clarity, books that promise transformation. Yet the fragmentation persists because they address the branches without understanding the root. A blueprint is needed, a structure that reveals how physical well-being, financial stability, ethical living, emotional balance, and spiritual depth are not separate goals, but parts of the same human architecture. Maimonides believed that the human being is designed for harmony. The intellect, the emotions, the body, and the moral will are meant to work together like instruments in a single symphony. When one instrument dominates or falls silent, the music of life loses its integrity. Health is connected to discipline. Wealth is connected to responsibility. Harmony is connected to understanding. And all of them are connected to the highest aspiration, aligning oneself with truth. The modern world offers many forms of guidance, but very few offer a unified vision. Maimonides does not give quick fixes or emotional slogans. He gives a blueprint grounded in reason, refined by ethical clarity, elevated by spiritual understanding. He teaches that a well-ordered life is the result of a well-ordered soul, and that cultivating the soul requires intellectual honesty, emotional refinement, and moral maturity. The human dilemma today is the same as the one Maimonides faced: how to bring coherence back to a fragmented life, how to integrate health, wealth, and harmony into a single meaningful path. How to move from confusion to clarity, from imbalance to equilibrium, from restlessness to a grounded sense of purpose. This blueprint exists, and it begins with understanding how Maimonides saw the human being, not as a scattered collection of needs, but as a unified creation capable of wisdom, virtue, and inner peace. To understand the Maimonidean blueprint for health, wealth, and harmony, one must begin with the foundation he built across his philosophical and legal writings. The human being is a unified creation, and the purpose of life is to perfect that unity through knowledge, virtue, and disciplined living. Maimonides refused to separate what many treat as opposing realms. For him, philosophy was not an escape from practical life, it was its illumination. Law was not a rigid external code, it was the architecture of a moral interior. Medicine was not merely a profession, it was an expression of responsibility for the vessel that holds the soul. In his medical writings, Maimonides emphasized moderation, prevention, and clarity. He taught that health is not a luxury, but a prerequisite for moral and intellectual excellence. In the Mishneh Torah, he writes that maintaining the body is among the ways of serving the Creator, for sickness diminishes the mind and restricts the spirit. The human being must take care of the body not out of vanity, but because a clear mind requires a healthy foundation. He understood the body as a finely balanced system, one that must be protected from extremes of indulgence and deprivation. His approach was both scientific and ethical, grounded in the belief that the body and soul work in concert rather than conflict. Maimonides saw wealth in a similar light. Wealth, in his view, is neither inherently good nor inherently corrupting. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value is determined by its use. In the 8 chapters, he describes virtue as the middle path between excess and deficiency. Applied to wealth, this means avoiding both miserliness and reckless extravagance. The truly wise person handles resources with responsibility, generosity, and purpose. Wealth becomes destructive only when it becomes an idol, or when the individual forgets that material means exist to support higher aims. For Maimonides, financial stability is valuable because it frees the mind from unnecessary anxieties and allows one to pursue intellectual and ethical refinement. He also insisted that true prosperity must be governed by justice. In the Mishneh Torah's Laws of Charity, he outlines a hierarchy that reflects deep psychological and social understanding. The highest level of giving is enabling another person to stand on their own, preserving dignity rather than merely providing relief. This approach reveals Maimonides' belief that wealth is part of the moral fabric of society. It is not an isolated pursuit, but a shared responsibility, woven into the community's well-being. When it comes to harmony, Maimonides addresses the most elusive yet essential dimension of human life, the balance between intellect and emotion, discipline and compassion, individuality and community, reason and revelation. In the Guide for the Perplexed, he argues that the human being must cultivate a mind capable of perceiving the order and rationality of creation. Yet he also emphasizes that knowledge alone is insufficient. Understanding must shape character, and character must shape conduct. Harmony, therefore, is not a passive state, but an active discipline. It arises when the emotional life is refined by reason, and the rational life is infused with humility. Maimonides believed that emotional imbalance is rooted in misunderstanding the nature of reality and the nature of the self. When people attach themselves to transient things or expect the world to conform to their desires, they become vulnerable to disappointment, anger, envy, and despair. True harmony arises from a clear vision of what is within one's control, what is outside it, and what deserves one's devotion. For him, the highest harmony is intellectual love of God, a state achieved not through mystical ecstasy, but through contemplating the wisdom embedded in creation. This contemplation is not reserved for scholars alone. Maimonides saw every human being as capable of ascending toward greater clarity. His writings are filled with a quiet confidence in the potential of the individual. Even those who begin in confusion can rise through study, discipline, and introspection. This ascent is not linear. It requires correction, recalibration, and the humility to recognize blind spots. But the path remains open to all who seek truth. What distinguishes Maimonides' blueprint from other systems of thought is the integration of the practical with the metaphysical. In his medical treatises, he gives detailed guidance on diet, exercise, sleep, and emotional hygiene. In his legal works, he outlines structures for ethical living, just economics, and social responsibility. In his philosophical writings, he confronts questions of purpose, existence, divine wisdom, and the limits of human understanding. He does not compartmentalize these domains. He weaves them together, revealing how the body supports the mind, how wealth supports virtue, and how harmony supports the ascent toward understanding. At the center of his system lies the principle of the golden mean, avoiding extremes in thought, behavior, and emotion. This principle is not a call to mediocrity, but a path to excellence through stability. By avoiding extremes, the individual gains the inner quiet necessary for wisdom. Emotional storms distort perception, excessive desires cloud judgment, and compulsive habits weaken the will. The golden mean protects the soul from these distortions, creating conditions for clarity. It also ensures that one's pursuits, whether related to health, wealth, or personal relationships, do not become obsessions that overshadow the larger purpose of life. Maimonides' perspective is profoundly rational, yet it is not limited to intellect. He recognizes the layers of the human being, the biological, the psychological, the moral, and the spiritual. Each layer affects the others. A person with a disordered emotional life will struggle to grasp philosophical truths. A person overwhelmed by financial insecurity will struggle to cultivate virtue. A person who neglects the body will find the mind dulled and the spirit restless. For Maimonides, wisdom begins with understanding this interdependence. In his letters, especially his correspondence of comfort and guidance, he reveals another dimension: compassion. Despite his reputation as a strict rationalist, his writings show deep empathy for human struggle. He speaks to the anxieties, confusions, and failures of real people trying to live well. His counsel is calm, measured, and encouraging. He does not demand perfection. He calls for gradual improvement, guided by reason and supported by disciplined habits. The Maimonidean blueprint emerges from this integration of philosophy, medicine, law, and pastoral care. It is a system rooted in observation of the natural world, refined by intellectual rigor and elevated by spiritual insight. This blueprint teaches that every aspect of life is interconnected and that harmony comes not from controlling the world, but from controlling oneself. To follow Maimonides' path is to cultivate clarity in thought, moderation in action, and purpose in all pursuits. This is the perspective he offers to anyone seeking a life of health, wealth, and harmony. It is not a promise of ease, but a promise of coherence, a framework for living with integrity, balance, and an ever-deepening understanding of the truth. To understand the full depth of Maimonides' blueprint for health, wealth, and harmony, one must enter the realm where his rational clarity meets his spiritual vision. It is here that the fragmented human being begins to find wholeness. Maimonides does not ask us to choose between the body and the soul, between the intellect and the emotions, between scientific understanding and spiritual longing. Instead, he teaches that the soul ascends when the whole person is aligned with truth. This integration is not merely practical, it is sacred. In the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides describes the human being as a creature suspended between the physical and the divine. The body binds us to the earth with its needs, impulses, and limitations. The intellect draws us upward, toward the eternal, toward the structure and order embedded in creation. Harmony emerges only when these dimensions are brought together in balance, neither suppressing the body nor neglecting the soul, but guiding each through reason. This synthesis begins with an idea fundamental to Maimonides. The world is intelligible. Creation is not chaotic or arbitrary. It is shaped by wisdom, governed by law, and receptive to understanding. To study the natural world is, therefore, not a distraction from the spiritual life. It is an entry into it. For Maimonides, the more a person understands the underlying order of existence, the more one is drawn to the one who is the source of that order. This is why he insists that intellectual pursuit, when undertaken with sincerity, becomes an act of devotion. This intellectual love is not cold or analytical. It is a form of inward clarity that awakens reverence. When the mind recognizes the intricacy of the universe, the stability of its laws, the elegance of its design, the soul experiences a quiet awe. This awe does not rely on miracles or spectacles. It arises from understanding itself. Maimonides teaches that the highest form of worship is contemplating the wisdom manifested in creation, allowing one's thoughts to align with the reality God established. Yet knowledge alone is insufficient. Without virtue, knowledge can lead to arrogance. Without discipline, it can become fragmented. This is why Maimonides insists that spiritual ascent requires ethical refinement. The emotions must be trained, the desires moderated, the habits purified. The soul cannot rise while the character is in disarray. The person whose heart is filled with anger, envy, pride, or fear cannot perceive truth clearly. Emotional turbulence distorts the intellect, just as unhealthy habits weaken the body. Thus, the path to harmony requires an integrated transformation. The body is disciplined through moderation. The mind is purified through study and reflection. The emotions are refined through ethical living. The soul is elevated through knowledge that awakens love. These layers form a single staircase, each dependent on the others. Maimonides sees this synthesis not as a mystical escape from the world, but as an encounter with the deeper order within it. The individual who practices moderation in eating, sleeping, and behavior cultivates a mind that is quiet enough to perceive truth. The individual who handles wealth responsibly and generously frees the heart from the tyranny of desire. The individual who cultivates virtue creates internal stability. These conditions prepare the soul to experience its true purpose, aligning itself with the wisdom of the Creator. This path is not immediate. Maimonides acknowledges the difficulty of achieving balance. He knows that the human being is pulled by powerful instincts, shaped by environment, susceptible to illusion. But he also believes that the soul possesses a deep longing for clarity. When a person experiences even a glimpse of inner harmony, it awakens a desire for more. The mind begins to seek coherence. The heart begins to seek peace, the body begins to seek discipline, and the entire being turns toward the one source of unity. Harmony, then, is not something one finds. It is something one becomes. It is the fruit of a life shaped by reason, guided by virtue, and oriented toward truth. It arises when one no longer lives in fragments, but in unity, when each part of the self supports the others. In this synthesis, wealth becomes more than material means. It becomes a reflection of responsibility, an opportunity for generosity, a protection against needless anxiety, and a foundation for stability. Health becomes more than the absence of illness. It becomes a discipline that supports clarity of mind and serenity of spirit. Harmony becomes more than a psychological condition. It becomes a spiritual orientation, a way of inhabiting the world with balance, humility, and wisdom. The culmination of this ascent is what Maimonides calls the intellectual love of God. This is not emotional ecstasy or mystical union. It is a deep, contemplative awareness of the divine wisdom that permeates existence. It is the joy of understanding, the peace of alignment, the fulfillment that comes when the mind rests in truth. This form of love transforms the individual. It shapes character, moderates desires, and produces an enduring sense of meaning. In this highest state, the person understands that health, wealth, and harmony are not ends in themselves. They are instruments that enable the soul to pursue its true purpose. They provide stability, clarity, and balance, allowing the mind to focus on what is eternal rather than what is fleeting. The more one ascends this path, the more one recognizes that the blueprint Maimonides offers is not a model for external success, but for inner wholeness. This synthesis reveals the profound unity at the heart of Maimonides' worldview. Reality is one. Truth is one. The human being, though composed of many parts, is meant to be one, and the path to oneness is the path of wisdom, moderation, and devotion. This is the transformation Maimonides envisions, a person who lives with purpose, thinks with clarity, feels with stability, acts with virtue, and seeks truth with humility. Such a person experiences harmony not as an escape from the world, but as a deeper engagement with it. Health becomes a form of stewardship. Wealth becomes a form of service. Harmony becomes a form of worship. This is the spiritual synthesis at the center of the Maimonidean blueprint, a life in which every dimension supports the ascent of the soul. To bring the Maimonidean blueprint into modern life, one must translate philosophy into daily discipline. Maimonides never intended his teachings to remain abstract ideas reserved for scholars. For him, wisdom becomes real only when it shapes how a person eats, speaks, thinks, works, and interacts with others. The blueprint for health, wealth, and harmony therefore unfolds not in theories, but in choices. Small, steady, intentional choices that accumulate into a well-ordered life. The first area is the cultivation of health. which Maimonides grounds in moderation, rhythm, and clarity. He warns against the belief that health is achieved through extreme regimens or sudden transformations. Instead, he teaches that the body thrives when one lives according to natural order. Regular sleep, balanced nutrition, gentle exercise, and emotional stability form the foundation of physical well-being. These are not glamorous practices, but they create the quiet internal environment necessary for clarity of mind. In a world saturated with conflicting health advice, Maimonides offers a stable compass. Avoid excess, avoid deficiency, pursue balance. One should eat to sustain strength, not to satisfy cravings. One should rest to restore energy, not to escape responsibility. One should move the body to preserve vitality, not to chase perfection. The goal is not aesthetic, but functional. The body must serve the higher purpose of the intellect and the soul. He also emphasizes emotional health, which he considers inseparable from physical well-being. Anger, fear, jealousy, and chronic worry disrupt the internal balance, weaken the mind, and erode the clarity necessary for wisdom. The individual must therefore cultivate emotional mastery. This does not mean suppressing feelings, but refining them, guiding them through reason. When confronted with frustration, one pauses, breathes, and acts with deliberation. When fear arises, one evaluates the situation calmly rather than surrendering to panic. When desire becomes excessive, one steps back and restores perspective. These practices protect the mind from becoming ruled by impulse. Maimonides also provides guidance for the use of wealth. He rejects both the glorification of wealth and the disdain of it. Wealth is neither virtue nor vice. It is a resource, an opportunity, a tool. To use it properly, one must cultivate responsibility and intentionality. One must earn with honesty, spend with self-restraint, give with generosity, and avoid letting possessions define identity. A practical application of this principle is to create a balanced structure for material life. One invests for the future without obsession. One works diligently, but not to the point of neglecting health or family. One gives charity regularly, not impulsively, and especially in ways that preserve the dignity of those receiving help. One avoids competing with others or measuring self-worth through material comparisons. By removing emotional entanglement from wealth, the individual gains freedom, not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from internal bondage. Another pillar of the blueprint is ethical living. Maimonides insists that ethical behavior is not optional for those seeking wisdom. The intellect cannot flourish in a person who acts unjustly, speaks deceitfully, or mistreats others. Every ethical failure introduces disorder into the soul, disturbing the harmony required for clarity. Practical application means committing to truthfulness, fairness, compassion, and respect. It means speaking carefully, avoiding gossip, fulfilling responsibilities, and treating every person with dignity. Maimonides also emphasizes the importance of community. He warns that one who isolates himself from society loses opportunities for virtue. Life among others creates occasions for kindness, patience, generosity, and humility. Harmony therefore includes contributing meaningfully to one's environment, offering support, practicing justice, promoting peace. These actions elevate both the individual and the community as a whole. Yet perhaps the most transformative application lies in how a person engages with the intellect. Maimonides teaches that the human mind is the pathway to spiritual elevation. Study, reflection, contemplation. These are not merely academic pursuits. They are the means through which the soul becomes attuned to truth. One should therefore cultivate regular intellectual practice. This may involve reading works of philosophy, studying the natural sciences, reflecting on ethical principles, or contemplating the deeper meaning of existence. Even small periods of daily study can reshape the mind over time, creating an inner structure that supports wisdom. However, intellectual pursuit must remain anchored in humility. Maimonides repeatedly warns that pride is the greatest obstacle to understanding. The individual must approach knowledge with reverence, recognizing the limits of human comprehension and the vastness of the truth one seeks. Humility preserves openness, prevents distortion, and allows wisdom to penetrate deeply. In practical terms, this means acknowledging when one is wrong, listening before speaking, questioning assumptions, and resisting the temptation to dominate conversations or impose opinions. It also means recognizing that genuine understanding requires time, patience, and discipline. The goal is not to impress others, but to refine oneself. Bringing the Maimonidean blueprint into daily life requires a subtle shift in orientation. One does not ask, what will bring me the fastest results, but rather, what will bring me closer to balance, truth, and purpose. This orientation transforms routine activities into opportunities for alignment. Eating becomes an act of stewardship. Working becomes an act of responsibility. Giving becomes an act of justice. Thinking becomes an act of devotion. Rest becomes an act of wisdom. Maimonides teaches that the ultimate harmony arises when one's daily actions reflect one's highest convictions, when the body serves the mind, when the mind seeks truth, and when the soul aligns with wisdom, life becomes coherent. The individual experiences a quiet strength, a stable peace, a sense of internal unity that withstands external pressures. This harmony does not depend on circumstances. It emerges from the integrity of the inner life. The blueprint also offers guidance for navigating uncertainty. Maimonides lived in turbulent times, political upheaval, religious persecution, personal loss. Yet he maintained unwavering clarity because he built his life on internal order rather than external stability. His example teaches that one cannot avoid the unpredictability of the world, but one can cultivate a resilient core. Through disciplined habits, ethical character, and intellectual grounding, the individual becomes capable of facing complexity without being overwhelmed. The modern world presents countless distractions, anxieties, and temptations, but the human soul remains the same as in Maimonides' time, seeking structure, meaning, and transcendence. His blueprint endures because it addresses the timeless dimensions of human life. It teaches that the path to flourishing is neither mystical nor fashionable. It is steady, intentional, balanced, rational, and deeply spiritual. To live according to this blueprint is to commit to lifelong refinement. One does not reach perfection, but one grows closer to integration. Each day becomes an opportunity to strengthen the body, clarify the mind, uplift the character, and orient the soul toward the source of all wisdom. This is the practical legacy of Maimonides, a life rooted in moderation, illuminated by understanding, shaped by virtue, and guided by an ever-deepening sense of purpose. In such a life, health becomes the foundation, wealth becomes the instrument, and harmony becomes the result. The quiet radiance of a soul aligned with truth.